Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Rebecca Ray, and I have the privilege of serving as Executive Vice President for Human Capital here at the Conference Board, and I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome you to today's webcast. It's called Effective Development Strategies for Increasing Women in Leadership, and specifically we're going to focus on some pivotal points for developing women leaders. I'm thrilled that you're here. We have a bumper crop of people who have chosen to join us today, so that's terrific. Just a couple of things. Many of you are old hands at this, and so you know how the drill goes. But you can ask questions in the chat box in the lower left-hand corner. You can change the size of the screen and what you can see by looking at the arrows in the corner. You can download the presentation if you'd like. You can hang on for just a few seconds after the webcast today and give us your opinions. We take that very seriously. We'd love to know your thoughts. And then finally, this, like all of our webcasts, will be available on demand within 48 hours. And there is always the opportunity to earn professional education credits. And so if we take a look at the next slide here, we can see that you have a variety of options. You need to let us know which one you'd like. And also, if you could notice that if you are looking for CPE credits, you must remain conscious and upright in the chair, because 3 times during the webcast they will ask you a question which you must answer by clicking OK. It's not a hard quiz, but you do need to be conscious to get there. So having done all of the housekeeping things I'm required to do, it's a distinct pleasure to welcome my co-author on this report, among others certainly, but Beatrice Gretsch-Kumbo. You can see here on the slide, she's the senior client partner and is instrumental in the initiative about advancing the leadership of women worldwide, serving at Korn Ferry. And it's been a delight to partner with her and the team on this. Welcome, Beatrice. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks. I'm so happy to be here with you and with the Conference Board. Advancing women is such an important conversation for us in the firm. It's a part of our larger portfolio of offerings at Korn Ferry. And, you know, I think that 2018 was really all about the conversation about women, and I'm hoping 2019 is about action. The work that we're focusing now with you is really about the how-tos. Mm-hmm. In 2017, we published the largest women's research on CEOs, and so we're happy to be joining you to figure out what leaders and organizations can do to really move the needle.
Well, that's terrific, and no, I have really enjoyed this. I think this is a passion project for a lot of us. And so I think what's great is right around the corner on March 8th is International Women's Day. And so what we will do is we will send a follow-up note with a link so that you can download the entire report. But you're getting a sneak preview today before the rest of the world. So we're happy to do that. And in fact, we can consider perhaps sharing the really great piece of research that you did earlier on women CEOs, if that's something you'd like to make available to folks as well.
That's
I don't
great.
want to put you on a spot, but if that's okay.
That makes sense.
Okay, great. Then you have the entire portfolio to pass on to your children. All right, so let's start a little bit by talking about what we hope to cover today. Beatrice, you want to walk us through?
Over the last 5 months or so, we've done a series of interviews, discussions, and we actually sent out our survey. So as a result, what we're going to share with you today is a picture of current representation of women in organizations. We'll talk about the pivotal points of women, of where women are often slowed down. We'll highlight some leading practices, and then we're going to talk about the opportunity we see. And that's really about the critical role we think the CHROs and senior talent leaders need to play.
No, I think that's right. And as a former chief talent officer, it's not as though we don't know what the goal is or that we don't all embrace getting the goal. It's what do you specifically do and what are companies doing that we can steal every good idea we hear. So thanks for that, Beatrice. Let me talk a little bit about the survey itself. So as Beatrice said, we began last fall with some focus groups with sitting CHROs and senior HR leaders. And we also, I think the slides are kind of popping around a little bit. So let's go back to the one where you have the really compelling circles there. So we had those focus groups. We also sent out a survey, and we had pretty good representation by headcount, by company size, and by industry. I think also we had certainly more women than men respond, which I think reflects the gender balance in many of the senior HR roles. and largely North American, although I doubt that that any of these insights would not be fairly applicable everywhere. Most of these folks had global responsibilities, and so they're looking across their entire organization for the kinds of insights that they could share with us. So what we're going to share with you is a compilation of the survey data, the interviews that we did, and the focus groups that we held in the last few months. So let's just jump in. So here's the headline. Most agreed that there had been some progress, that there was, it was better now than it used to be. And so 62% actually said that they felt that way. But 66% of us told us we still have a long way to go. They still think that there's some level of inadequacy in terms of representation of women at different points in the leadership pipeline. And they were concerned, I think, about why progress seemed to have been stalled, and also what specifically can we do about it. So that's really where we began to see the big headline in the report. So Beatrice, when you think about representation of women in the pipeline, one of the questions we asked was, what would you think would be an adequate representation of women? Now, common sense, you'd say, must be 50%. It's pretty much what you have in the population. That's not exactly what they told us. They told us it was a little bit different of a number.
Yeah, the interesting thing about that is, if you look at the representation, and obviously it's significantly declined, especially as you got to the top of the house. But really what struck me was that what we heard is that adequate representation is a long way from where we're at today. Yeah. So this isn't going to be about incremental change. This really is going to require us to be very focused and intentional to drive real movement, because we've got quite a ways to go.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think, when you look at what in the aggregate people told us was adequate representation, 46%, we don't hit that 46% over much of this at all, except that initial turn, which is one of the two pivotal points we'll talk about when you first become a leader. I think, to your point, it is about massive change that needs to happen, and really strident action. I think, a lot of the work that we have done here at the Conference Board, our new CEO, Steve Odland, was formerly with a subsidiary of the Conference Board at the Committee for Economic Development in Washington. And that's a very well-respected think tank. They did the Marshall Plan after World War II, and he's been at the forefront, along with many CEOs and business leaders, around how do you increase the representation of women in the boardroom, which is a little separate from our conversation today. But his argument is it's truly simple. Make every other replacement on the board a woman, and you'll reach parity. Because some of the projections, like from the World Economic Forum and others, talk about some astronomical number out there in the 2045 or so before you begin to get gender parity on board. So I think this is a compelling issue that we need to absolutely take a look at. So we've got a question here. And the question was around the demographics of the survey, about does it include military organizations. I don't believe that we had more than perhaps just a couple of responses in the military, representing the military. But there are some in the other that are just not large enough, significantly large enough to call out separately. So, well, if we could just maybe take a look at some of the reasons why these barriers continue to exist.
Yeah, we wanted to get some insights on really why is it so slow? And what you're seeing now on the slide is the most significant barriers that were identified. And as you can see, that these barriers really exist across the entire life cycle, from the point of hiring, promotion, and throughout development. There's a few here that I find interesting, maybe that we should just spend a moment more on. One is the lack of early in career opportunities. So we know that it's critically important for leaders to get P&L or operation experience. We know that's one of the things that really prepares them, and we know that helps significantly from an experience viewpoint for them to get the position. But yet, that's really challenging. Many women don't get that opportunity. So what it's really going to take is a very intentional plan. It's not going to work just to have someone who's been identified as a high potential or put on a slate. Really, it needs to have a plan to get the experiences that individual will need that will make them be a qualified candidate for a broader, more senior position. Another one maybe is the lack of accountability. So we've talked quite a bit about this in the past, and you'll hear us talk a little bit more about it further in the presentation. But having accountability, not just at the top. You know, when we talk to clients, having alignment around the top and the priority of the strategy, that's often there, or at least sometimes there. Where it falls apart is 2 and 3 layers below that. So it's about having accountability at the top and then driving accountability from an execution standpoint.
Well, what we know about leader accountability is that if you don't make them accountable, not much happens.
That's right.
Whether you're looking at someone who's able to foster a culture of inclusion or retain or engage or certainly develop talent. And unless that's part of the metric by which you judge the success of a leader, it often doesn't get the focus it should.
I think that's fair.
Yeah. Well, you know, as we look to some of the things that we can do about this, I mean, those are some of the systemic challenges. We asked the survey respondents, what does move the needle? What does sort of get you to closing that gender gap? And so if you look at this slide, it talks about the top 5 practices that the respondents gave us as indications of things that actually move the needle. And the top 3 I just want to focus on for a moment. So pay equity was clearly the top score. And pay equity it's partly the dollars, but it's also the messages that are sent about fairness. So if the work that you contribute, the work that the ways in which you support the organization is valued less simply because you happen to be of one gender or another, or pick any other group, the inherent unfairness there, I think, sends messages to many women about, is this the place I want to be? The second one is around exposure, and that's exposure to the people who are in a position to move them along and advance their careers, so certainly that's key. And the third one was around recognition programs so that women who are successful are championed or held as examples or encourage other women to say, well, I think I could do this too, or I know her path and I know some of the struggles she's had and I think I can do this too. Also on the list were individual development plans. I think that's key for all leaders because all leaders have blind spots or skill gaps or that sort of thing. And then of course coaching, which helps in performance and also around career effectiveness. So I'd like to spend just a moment on this pay equity issue because I think it's part of a larger ecosystem. And I wondered if you could speak. I know Korn Ferry does some work here around the pay equity issue, and I wondered if you could share some of the things you're talking to clients about.
Well, as you said, it's critical, but it's also complex. When we look at our pay data across, we see a common trend across countries. We don't see a lot of differences from a trend standpoint. 2 important things maybe to acknowledge. Gender pay is significantly influenced by the number of men that are actually in the high-paying positions. So when you think about the gender pay gap, that's why it's over 17% when you look at it globally. But when you look at equal pay for equal work, you see a much smaller gap. Mm-hmm. And that's really comparing men and women to similar roles within the same company and within the same function. It's important to understand that these averages really don't show the nuances. You really need to look much deeper. But there's a significant difference between gender pay gap and equal pay for equal work. Mm-hmm. When we work with clients, having a very disciplined process to take a look at this is critically important. Because what we often find is when you're not using a disciplined process, sometimes organizations and leaders start to tinker with the symptoms, not the root causes. Right. And that's really where it's almost counterproductive.
One of the things that struck me in looking at this graphic was around the perception of pay inequity or disparity. And I think sometimes people maybe need to have a different level of transparency so that they could dispel that in those areas where maybe some companies have done a great job in closing that gap. And you know, some of these are relatively small percentages. So maybe it's a matter of how companies might educate folks about how we develop our leaders, how we advance our leaders, how we pay our leaders, how we hold them accountable. You know, that entire range of things that could be more transparent, perhaps.
Yeah, I think transparency is really critical, but I think we all know, depending upon the organization, sometimes that's much more challenging to do than we would anticipate it. But driving an awareness, really understanding the roles and understanding the pay, and having those conversations, I think is really important.
Well, even if you don't go all the way to what Whole Foods does, which is you can make an appointment and go down and take a look at everyone's salary.
Yes, wouldn't that be something?
Yes, not every company is perhaps ready to do just that, but there has to be, I think, some way to communicate more of the fairness. Because if they've done a lot of good work and yet the perception is there, you know, it's counterproductive. So, well, thank you for sharing this. I can imagine that this is particularly helpful for clients. So. Let's go to the things that people told us in the survey that were not as effective. Now, this is the aggregate slide, so in a moment I'm going to talk about where some people are doing this and it is very effective. But here are the bottom 5. Most of them do not have a standing task force or committee dedicated to improving the number of women in leadership roles. They either don't have or don't find effective sponsorship programs, you know, kind of career champions for female leaders in hypos. And I wonder sometimes if it's that they don't teach people how to be a sponsor versus a mentor versus a champion. You know, at that organization, what means what? You know, how do we help leaders be a sponsor for someone else? So I wonder if it's that they have them and it's not effective, or they just don't go there. And in some of the focus groups, I think it was sort of a range of responses. Another one that's in the bottom 5 was a dedicated internal recruiting team. And I think that is about, to your point earlier, casting a wider net, looking at people earlier in career, even before they take that first turn into management, and encouraging them to begin thinking about themselves as a leader in that organization, and what would it take, and how do we, and we're going to talk about this in a few moments, but how do we balance the perception of what we think might be a tremendous workload, and how does that balance? And that's why a lot of women opt out, because they perhaps have a unrealistic impression of what it would be. And so how do we help them through that and make that decision? Another one that's closely related to the sponsors issue is that they don't have C-level leaders and board members who are assigned to be champions for these senior female leaders. And then a lot of organizations are not finding that it's effective to put programs in that help women return to the workplace after elder care, children, some other life event that they've chosen to take out of time. So these are the 5 that folks in the aggregate told us were not as effective. And yet, when you looked at the successful practices for the very large organizations, those at 10 billion or more, they said there were 3 things that had a greater impact for them. One was the standing corporate task force or committee, which, you know, as we just took a look at, was one of the bottom least effective or least used ones in the aggregate. But those who are the very large companies with success in doing a couple of key practices, that was one of them for them. And I wonder if it's because they're larger, tend to have been in place a little bit longer, maybe have a more sophisticated sense of what leadership development needs to look like. I'm not sure. But look at the second one. It's pay equity, which we recall was the number 1 from the overall aggregate. And the third one was around recognition programs. So, you know, those things among those companies tell us that's what works. The standing committee, pay equity, and recognition.
Yeah, you know, the interesting thing about this is I think what we're seeing or hearing is a fact of how mature and how really the programs have been built into the culture. I think that when we see organizations that have been doing things that are moving the needle, it is over a period of time. It's with a significant amount of intention and dedication to doing it and doing it well. That's where we see it. So it might be a slow start, But sticking to it, I think clients are telling us it is moving the needle, especially in these three areas.
Yeah, and I think when they've positioned something as either effective or ineffective in a sort of forced choice ranking, which is the way we sent that question to them, it's either that they don't do it or they don't do it well. And it could be reflective in some of the conversations we've had with folks. It could be that they've tried it, it didn't go well, they dropped it and went to something else.
Right.
But I think that's exactly right. You know, what's amazing to me, and I had the privilege of participating in the Global Leadership Forecast in partnership with a couple of other organizations, DDI and EY. And what we found was just among regular leadership development kinds of things, the basics that are not done consistently. And you can't get to affecting this kind of change in terms of getting women leaders in representative numbers without getting those building blocks right. So I think that's exactly right. So I know as we began to look at the data and as we had these conversations, and certainly from your client work, you've talked a lot about HR's role, and as sometimes as discouraging as today's results might look, that there's hope. And you know, you had some thoughts as to what those HR leaders should be doing and how they might be able to move things along and advance them. Would you mind sharing some of that?
I really think we're at a critical point. I said earlier that, you know, now more than ever, the conversation is at a much higher pitch, if you will. And I think that what we're seeing is HR leaders stepping into a role where they're leading advancing women. And the conversation is high and the awareness is growing. I mean, boards are interested in this. In our conversations with very senior leaders at the top, this is a critical priority. What I want to acknowledge is I don't think this is easy. That's not the point, but really the stars are lining up, if you will. The awareness is there, and it's going to take courage. It's going to take courage from leaders and courage from the HR leadership team to really disrupt the historical status quo processes and practices maybe that have been embedded, to really to take the initiative and really call it out. Because it's going to take courage to move the needle.
You know, I think these HR leaders do have a critical role, but it does take courage, especially when you're sort of like Sisyphus trying to move the rock up the hill. Like everything else, it's tone at the top. And so you want to hope that you have a CEO and that his or her leadership team galvanizes around this as an important business driver. And we all know the data, whether it's things we've done together or things that are in the public domain. There's a distinct advantage for having a more diverse board and to having more women on boards and to having more women in leadership teams. So that's not the question. But it does take a lot of courage when you're the one that raises the issue, when you're the HR leader that has to say to someone that his or her favorite person isn't quite in line with where the organization needs to go, and to have courage to challenge people in their assumptions, right?
Yeah, it reminds me of a conversation I had last week with the CHRO, and we were talking about this very topic. And the question really was, I have courage, but I'm not sure that is within my remit. I'm not sure that I really have that responsibility. And what we've started to talk about is how can that leader really go to the CEO and ensure that responsibility is given to the right person, be it to the CHRO or to the CEO, but someone owns that. And to get really clear on, and maybe even permission to call it out when things are really not equitable, when the organization isn't really following the strategy of advancing women. So it does take courage. It also does take probably some conversations with the CEO and the peer group to really understand the role that all the leaders play and the importance.
Yeah. So part of it is about building champions and partners among business leaders, because I think for any of us, if we're the sole voice in the wind, always harping on a particular issue, it's going to have less effectiveness, I think. The right cause, right comments, heart's in the right place. I think you have to build a coalition of people who are going to carry that mantle with you. And part of it is taking a look at every single element of the talent management process in particular. So when you hold the line that this position is not going to be filled until we have a diverse slate to choose from, and this needs to be, gender equal, or whatever other processes you want to put in place, because that's going to be that really takes a commitment, I think, from all the leaders to say this is how we will be as an organization, and this is what our commitment is to women and minorities in leadership.
Yeah, I agree. I think it does take alignment and agreement, and oftentimes, sometimes that alignment isn't in place. So the CHRO is driving the strategy around talent management, and really uncovering and making sure the high potential development is done, and all the other important things related to the power of talent. Chief Diversity Officer may be focusing on a strategy of inclusion, which logically sounds like it's connected, but oftentimes it's not aligned as much as it needs to. So aligning those strategies and creating agreement on what really needs to happen to make sure that you have the power of the executive team is important.
I think that's right, and I think a lot of it is what do you hold up in your organization as exemplary leadership or as quality contributions. There's quite a few comments here around recognition, and I think there have been some places in organizations or professions where this has just been sort of closer to the norm than not the norm for a while. I think professional service firms have done a pretty good job, at least in the last few years, of kind of putting forward, here are women's programs, these are outstanding women leaders. I say this as a former military brat. My dad was in the Army, and I know the military has come a long way and sometimes led the charge in terms of looking at equitable ways to reward and promote women as well. There's a question here that wants to know a little bit more about sponsorship and advocacy in some of these organizations. I wondered if maybe in your work with clients, there are a couple of things that you identify as these are really exceptional practices, or these are the kinds of things that at the core need to be in place.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. Probably in the last year, we've had a lot more conversations around sponsorship and advocacy, and I think something is important to acknowledge is to be an advocate is to really be understanding what that individual needs in her experience set, as well as knowledge that really will help her move to a broader role or to be able to move in the organization. And oftentimes, the advocate isn't really as engaged. So some of the things we're seeing is we're working with a client right now where they are placing advocates in the business. So in this case, what we've worked through with them from a succession standpoint is we're looking at high potentials and their next move. And we're finding advocates in those business units for their next move. So they can start to think through the move as it relates to their experience set. I think also it's not that sponsors aren't important, it's sponsors aren't enough. I mean, that's just it. People need advocates. People need, and women need, someone who's really looking after their advancement and really a champion for them.
Yep, and helping to set in motion the things that would position that person for success.
Exactly.
I mean, all of us, when we look back, we always think, oh, well, I was eminently qualified and prepared for that role move. And then you forget way back when you first were offered something, it was like, oh, wow, and it takes a little while till you feel that. But I think a lot of the times if we were successful, it's because we had somebody who cared enough to help position us to do that. Yeah. I've got a couple of questions here. Maybe I can share them with you. So we've got a question about, well, here's someone who said that they didn't apply for a leadership role in the past because she had a young child and wanted a work-life balance. And this kind of speaks to some of the commentary around helping people understand what's possible and not to have not to make a decision based on a perception of work life.
Right.
But I wondered if you had some thoughts there.
Yeah, I think that flexibility and how we integrate our work with our personal lives is an issue for so many of us. I think the conversation that we're having with clients is women don't typically like to ask for flexibility. They don't typically like to, I mean, it kind of gets back to the conversation about the advocate, right? Women don't usually promote themselves. They don't usually ask for things.
No, we just think if we put our heads down, we work really, 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 really hard, they'll
We just-
notice. They'll just bring us along.
Yep. And that's really not the case.
Yeah.
So oftentimes movement happens when you really have the courage to have the conversation about what you need. Another thing is that a study we just completed, which I thought was really interesting. I think we all know that women are leaving organizations, in some cases at a higher pace. Oftentimes people think they're leaving to go to another company. Actually, what we're hearing is they're going to find more flexibility. So if they don't find it internally, they're going to find it by walking out the door.
Right.
And so I think from a leadership perspective, understanding the flexibility that's needed in your organization is critical. And then as a woman, really talking about what you need and what could help you. That's your role.
Got some great questions coming in. I'm going to share or comments.
Okay.
So here's a question that says, women need more deliberate coaching and mentoring. Yes, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Here's a question that says, what if women don't want to be advanced because they don't see anyone in leadership roles leading a healthy, balanced life? Is anyone having this conversation?
Yeah, I think having role models and seeing what is possible is so important. What we hear from clients is actually they're surprised women don't see it. What they're not understanding is the conversation hasn't occurred with women at the top, with high potential or women who might be thinking about aspiring to something else. So they're really not having that channel of communication to really understand how women are doing it.
And I think that's part of it, but I also think there's the cultural overlay. So it's just like if you have parental leave that men can take advantage of, but every man thinks, it's a kiss of death if I
Right.
actually take it. That's not helpful. So I think to your point, it's really around the organizational cultural messages that say, we expect you, and I hate to use the word balance, but let's say integrate your work and your life.
Yep.
Or we expect you to figure out ways in which you can have that kind of balance that you're comfortable with. And there may be times in life where you have to dial one thing up and one thing down.
Yep.
And that isn't static, and that also has to be an organization that allows for that to happen. Because if women think that they have to be on a particular track where their life is a hellish nightmare, oh, sorry, I'm on camera, where it's a challenge, then that's the kind of thing where people just opt out. And to your
Yep.
point, they go start their own organization or their own consulting practice or whatever the case may be. But there's more good stuff coming in. So let's just say, here's a question: how do you identify champions for women?
So part of it is it's an equation to be looked at from both sides, right? So typically what we see working best is talking to the individual who's looking for a sponsor or an advocate and really understanding what would be helpful for them. Then getting a leader who's really interested in doing it. Oftentimes where we see it fall apart is where it's expected that someone needs to play the role of an advocate or a sponsor, but really we don't get the fit right. So getting the fit right is absolutely important. And actually, I think something that might be a surprise is there's more people that are interested in doing that than you may think.
Which is refreshing, I think.
Yeah.
Look, all of us have people in our lives that we care about. And particularly people who are successful leaders at the top of an organization. They're thinking about their husbands, their wives, their daughters, their sons as they come through and thinking, I hope someone is an advocate for them or a champion for them. Great questions coming in. There's another one that says, how do you set up a person for success as they go into leadership roles? And I think most of us would point to things like, training, acculturation, support systems, that sort of thing. But doesn't it also take some people who take an act? It's not just they've gotten the role. Now they're in it. We want them to be successful.
Yeah.
Doesn't that also mean we have to put together sort of a cocoon? That's not right. But a couple
safe
people could,
place.
yes, safe place for them to
Yes.
at least get into the pool and start swimming before the tsunami hits.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
So from your perspective, what other things could organizations be doing to ensure that at these leadership turns in the pipeline that they're going to be successful?
I think what we see is a few things. One is women often are incredibly critical of their own performance. So having a place in which a woman can have a safe place to talk about what are the challenges, what's going on, how might they need more support is absolutely important. We also actually make a lot of suggestions around women having good insight into what they need to focus on and what help they might need before they go into role. Mm-hmm. So oftentimes it's like we put somebody in a role and it's like, hey, they're not swimming fast enough. Why aren't they swimming fast enough? What we're suggesting and seeing work is before somebody goes into the pool, if you will, let's have them really do a good sense from a self-awareness standpoint of what the challenges of the role are, what kind of support do they need, so they have a responsibility, and then from an organization, making sure that we connect them to somebody who can help them work through and really start to find their way in their new role.
I wonder sometimes if it's partly reflective of the fact that as you're a woman or a minority coming through, you're often seen as, the representative of your food group. And so I think you just sort of naturally begin to think you have to be twice as good to be thought of as half as good. Right?
Yeah.
And I wonder sometimes if that drives the decision not to ask a question or ask for help because it would be perceived that you are somehow less qualified. I mean, there's enough studies out there, we could pick anyone you like, but men exude more confidence than do women, generally speaking. And so quite often, if you think that you don't exude the confidence, you're sort of at neutral, but now you ask a question or you ask for help, now you're diminished somehow. And I wonder, how would we go about making that safe enough for women and minorities to talk about the help that they need? Everybody needs help. It's a question of whether or not you feel comfortable doing it.
Yeah. Well, I think something we all know that when you're the only person in the room, it's really hard sometimes to find your voice. Mm-hmm. So having situations where you're not the only woman in the room is an important aspect for you as a leader as well as for the leadership team. I think the work we're doing around building an inclusive culture is also an interesting thing to comment here about, and that is it's interesting. Men really want to figure out how to play this, to how to build an inclusive culture. That's my personal belief. Sure, there's sometimes where the risk of what they have to lose or how their life might be altered at work is an issue, but I think that having men play a role in making sure that there's an inclusive conversation happening, if they're not hearing from the woman in the meeting, if they know that she has something on her mind, really engaging her and pulling that, increasing her participation is important.
I think that's right. I think it's, to your point, if you feel like you have to speak on behalf of all of your people, whatever food group that is, it's exhausting.
Yes.
And the higher you go in the leadership ranks, the more scrutiny, the less room you have for failure. And so you combine all of that, it starts to be a heady sort of cocktail, I think.
Yeah.
I wish that you could see, as I can, some of the comments here. These are, I think I'm going to capture these somehow, maybe share these back out. There are people who are talking about some of their success stories, and some of them worked in organizations where they were actually given flexibility, which is what enabled them to have both a career and a personal life. But I do think it's a lot around organizations that not only choose to do these things, but also communicate it well enough.
Yes.
It's like those organizations that don't tell people they're a high potential, and then after the high potential has resigned, they say, "But we have great plans for you. We have great plans." You got to help people understand. Here's a question around Well, it's not so much a question, but yeah, we'll go with this one. Can you comment on strategies for getting credit for your voice when you do speak up? Even senior women in a room with multiple women still have their ideas given less credit than the men in the room. Or my own personal favorite, when they repeat it, and it just sounds so much better.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's beautiful.
Yeah, I think that we can all reflect on moments of that. I think that, the interesting thing is that when you have a team that really is operating from a high performance aspect, that is living inclusion, if you will, and the balance is happening, things like that don't happen as much. I'm not sure I would advocate that drawing attention to the instance is probably not the best way. What I've seen happen, though, after a conversation, let's say, where a particular view is sort of shut down, right? Mm-hmm. And in reflection, you look at it and you go, boy, the voice of the underrepresented person in the room wasn't heard. Maybe that's a woman, maybe it's another diverse population. I think starting the meeting the next time with a conversation of, look, on reflection, there's some things that didn't seem to be heard well. Let's try to set this up where we can have a more inclusive conversation, and drawing attention is sort of at the beginning of saying this is something we have to really do a better job of.
And I want to believe in the inherent goodness of all people. And I'm sure, that sometimes things happen, you're not even aware that you're doing it. So it takes, I think, sometimes someone who feels as though he or she has a good relationship with that person. So say, I'm sure this is not how you mean it, but kind of felt like as though they didn't say much after your comment because maybe they felt shut down. Sometimes that's enough to do it. The other thing that I've seen work well is when you get people who are either kind of aware of this, and they can be certainly of either gender, and they would actually be active in the meeting and say, I'd like to hear more about that, or tell me more, because I can see how this might work, and to actually give someone maybe the license to continue to talk, or to call out people who aren't as participative, or people who don't feel as though they're being heard, and that takes, I think, some courage of their own.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting because all of these things, as you can get a sense of, there's not a one-size-fits-all, right? It's about figuring out what's working in your organization. It's about understanding, the headwinds that are unique to women, and what do you need to do as a leader to create a more inclusive environment.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think it requires an awareness, and it requires courage. It's not that we don't know what we'd like the outcome to be.
Yeah.
I think we just have to have the courage to kind of get those things in motion. I'm kind of watching the time, and I know we still have another pivotal point we haven't really touched on just yet. So I'm going to take us along here a little bit to increasing the representation of women in manager roles. So, when we think about pivotal positions, there's really the two that I think pop up in most of the literature, certainly in ours. It's that first switch into management. You go from individual contributor to now perhaps supervising your former buddies, and all that goes with. And then also later on when you go into an SVP level role. So a couple things here that we could do to help with this is to be intentionally inclusive. It's making sure that the pipeline to begin with, or the candidates for that pipeline, is truly diverse. And I think to many of the things we've said is to really have a candid conversation early in career with women as to, do you aspire to these things? Because I know from your work in the earlier report on women CEOs, many of them hadn't thought of themselves as a women CEO until someone came to them and said, I could see you being successful as a CEO here, and encouraging them to continue. So I think that's important. And then some of the things that we've talked about in the past, which is around checking your assumptions, to assume that maybe a woman isn't interested in being advanced because she has 2 children. That's just so short-sighted, I think, or whatever other assumptions we make that limit folks. I think it's important that we have transparent conversations, that we tell people we see great potential, we see great things ahead. Mm-hmm. Are you interested in pursuing? Can we have a conversation around what that might take and whether there's interest? So I think I think that's important, and it kind of reflects many of the things that we've talked about.
Yeah, just one thing I'd love to comment on about how do you create more conversation. What we're seeing movement is women self-nominating themselves into being considered for broader roles. So, it's instead of putting the pressure on leaders or expecting people to be able to effectively or accurately identify high potentials, what if we asked women to nominate into certain positions? It's surprising at how sometimes that really does, untap some talent you didn't even know you had.
Mm-hmm. I've got a quote here I want to share, and then I've got a couple of questions that just sort of popped up and I think are worth maybe just mentioning, even if it's brief given these closing minutes. In the report, when you have a chance to read it, we've profiled several people. In fact, I'll talk in a few moments about the next 2 webcasts in this series and how those will be some of the folks that we profiled. But here's a quote from Alex Rizzuto at McCormick, and talking about directly engaging managers to help them truly understand these challenges that particularly women earlier in career might be having. Mm-hmm. And they might be challenges, they might be perceptions of challenges, and maybe to have a candid conversation around how that might work. And if you can identify what the challenges are, or the hesitations, or whatever they may be, you can figure out a plan in many cases to mitigate them. So it was a privilege to learn a little bit about them. And I think, this also is sort of that same thing around an ecosystem. Can you walk through how you frame this for clients?
Yeah. So when you think about it, we said a moment ago that it's really not a one-size-fits-all, but there's certain things we're sure of. We know that gender bias plays a significant role in limiting gender parity, and driving awareness and understanding of bias is a critical first step. When we're helping in organizations with what's going on in their environment, it's really about looking at the talent management, the talent life cycle, and identifying the obstacles. And that's really what needs to be adjusted often to make sure that women can move.
Let's talk about that second critical pivot point, as women start to move into SVP or equivalent roles.
Yeah.
Could you speak a little bit to some of the things we found there?
So here you see some differences, right? And some uniqueness of women in senior roles. The ones that maybe caught my attention more, and we've talked a little bit about it, and that's linking high potential women to critical experiences. Mm-hmm. And really how it's more than just putting them on a slate. Identifying what they really need to have, and making sure that they have the advocate to help them. Another one that I think we often talk about is this line of sight. We're working with a client now where actually we do a tremendous amount of assessments, as you can imagine, sure. Right? And this client had said to me, I'm not sure that we really have high potential women that exhibit some of the enterprise characteristics that we need for them to step into a broader role, such as an SVP position. And what we did is we actually went back, we had tested a pretty significant group of leaders in their organization. We actually mapped the men and the women to our CEO profile. And you may not be surprised about this, but actually the women in many cases were actually stronger and closely aligned to the CEO profile. Yes. It was just those women, they really weren't known. Yeah. There wasn't a line of sight.
Right.
So what the decision that what we did there is we did 2 things. We created an environment through a program where the decision makers around placement into these positions could actually see the women.
Yeah, that's critical.
And that's an important.
We've got a great question here, and maybe this is a good time to ask it. We talk about flexibility, and it could be in terms of, hours worked or co-sharing jobs or being able to move freely in and out of the organization in different roles. And that's great. But as women move to higher levels of leadership, what does flexibility start to look like for them? Because in the minds of some CEOs, that's their team, and by God, there's going to be a certain work profile that starts to look there. So, what's the thinking there?
You know, one of the things that I remember from our CEO Women Speak research was one of the women said to me, it's really, I have to figure out who I'm actually going to apologize to. Is it going to be my team, or is it going to be to my husband at home? Because I think it is one about realizing that you can't have it all, right? And balancing is a hard situation, and flexibility, I think, for women as they grow in their career, is figuring out how to have the right support around them, and that may be people at home, people at work, that really, you know, can allow them to attend to the things that they need to. It's really about support.
I think that's right. And I think the higher you go in any organization, and I think if you're a man or a woman, you've got to have a supportive partner.
That's right.
And because it is tough. And let's be candid, the further you go along in a career, the more is expected of you in terms of, you know, dedication and hours and all those kinds of things. So I understand that. The question is, what can an organization do to sort of try to make that a fair and level playing field, regardless of what gender you are? You know, I've got a question here, and it says, I'm finding a particular gender bias as a woman, providing direction to men in our company's overseas operations.
Yeah.
Is that common?
Yes, I think it is.
Really?
I think that what is common is that depending on the culture in which you're operating, there's, you know, different stereotypes and there's different beliefs. And so when you operate in the U.S., you may experience something very different than if you're operating in Latin America or in Asia. So I think there is a difference. I think that's why it's critically important to have the conversation around bias and the things that really, you know, it's not only acknowledging the bias, but it's really talking about what can you do to create an environment where women feel like they can be themselves as a leader. You know, that often requires a pretty significant discussion.
Yeah. I think it goes back to your comment earlier about checking your assumptions. Because if you're making decisions based on erroneous assumptions, you know, we know where we're going to land. I know that you wanted to just touch on this. Was there anything more about this model that you wanted to call out?
So the only thing I would call out in the middle of this model, what you see is really where inclusion unlocks the power of gender parity. And, you know, we see it having two pieces. The structural piece is really making sure you have bias-free talent practices. And then the behavioral side is really about an inclusive mindset, really decisions that can be made, and creating the right culture.
You know, I've got a quote here that I think is worth mentioning here. It says, a colleague of mine, this is a woman named Rosanna who's quoting, a colleague of mine figured this out. She said, I'm an amazing wife, a wonderful and nurturing mom, and a great lawyer, just not all at the same time. And that helped her cope.
Yep, that's perfect. And that goes back to my comment about who are you going to, you know, apologize to or, you know, maybe disappoint.
Yeah. And I think, you know, there's a comment here that's well taken, is that not everyone has a strong support network. You know, we could argue that it does take a village to raise children or provide elder care or a variety of other challenges that, you know, many adults have. And it does take a support system. And I think organizations need to be sensitive and not make assumptions, because sometimes people don't have quite the support that they would need. And we also never really know, and I know this as leaders, you never really know what some people on your team are going through. Yeah. And
very true.
It's always amazing to me that people come in and continue to swing for the fence. We just need to make that a little bit less hard, I think. Well, you know, one of the companies we had an opportunity to spend some time in fact, they hosted us at one of the meetings, was the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. And we have a quote here from Mary Lee Handel, who's the CHRO there. She'll be joining us on a later webcast. But I think what was amazing is that, you know, her take on this was that they wanted to ensure that every candidate, regardless of gender, was highly qualified. And it wasn't just, to your point, checking the box. And I remember sitting there and listening to a panel of their highly placed women leaders and the journey that they had been on, and there was not a B player in the group,
Yeah.
So I think this is a perfect example of believing and actually executing what you believe. So let me just mention one other thing, because this is I just grabbed this from a recent article in Fortune, and it just talked a little bit about leadership, and I thought it would be important to call out, because regardless of where you are in the political spectrum, and just set all that aside right now, but in the article it talked about how men see power and how women see power. And when men talk about sometimes their power, it would be the kinds of things that they would point to, and be like, refusing to give in or exerting your power, that sort of thing. When women talk about leadership, it's more about influence and impact.
Yeah.
And it seems more like you would be leading with a group or leading as part of a team. And I think that's just naturally how women sort of show up often as leaders. That is not to say that everybody fits in a box, and I'd be the last one to say that. But I just wondered what your thoughts were on the description of this as having impact and influence.
Yeah, I saw the article. I loved it, and I think that the interesting thing too is the conversation is allowing women to step into it in a different way. I think even only a few years ago, I don't think women really wanted to talk about power. I don't think
It's almost an embarrassing thing.
Yes, and I think actually there's nothing wrong with power, and I think women are becoming more and more comfortable with it.
But I have to tell you, it's really important to see early in career for you to see models of people. I remember once working at a financial services firm where women were few and women in leadership were few, and there was this one woman there, at a firm that will remain nameless. She defied every single stereotype. This was back in the day with the shoulder pads and the ties and okay. So she defied every stereotype there was. She lived her life the way she wanted to, and people absolutely loved her.
Yeah.
And she ran a complex of large offices, and she was just wonderful and dynamic, and she was secure in her own skin. Yeah. And that's, I think, half of it. She had that level of confidence that you see in many leaders, but sometimes not always displayed as much with women.
Yeah. And for some reason, I don't know the situation, but it sounds like she brought her whole self
She did.
to work.
I mean, she did everything that you were supposed to do. She dressed rather flamboyantly. She had large jewelry. She was out there. And she had, feelings and heart. It was like, okay, come on down. She was fabulous.
It's great.
But, whenever you see authentic leaders, that's very compelling.
Yes.
And what an inspiration to a lot of us. So, a couple of actions just as we close out now. Things that, kind of recap what we've shared. I think a couple of things we just talk about is get early conversations with people. Be candid, be transparent, be encouraging, help identify where they need to grow and stretch, and make sure that they can get those experiences as often as men, as early as possible, because early in career P&L experience is one of the best,
Absolutely.
the best things ever. And organizationally, take a look at the things you can control, like pay equity, like diverse slates of candidates, recognition programs, which is huge.
Yep. I'd also say identify high potentials early, and that don't wait for managers to do that.
Yep.
Find ways in which you can get underrepresented groups and women in the conversation.
And that's corporate-owned talent. That's not some manager who doesn't want to
That's
lose
right.
the A player who's going to just
That's
kind of keep them under a box. No. That's a corporate thing. So I'm just going to kind of close out with a couple of things. I want to make sure that folks know about the upcoming Women's Leadership Program, but I also want to share that there's 2 more pieces to this webcast series. And so, as I mentioned, on March 8th, we'll make sure that the the registrants here get a link to the report. But you don't want to miss the next 2 webcasts, because that's when we'll have folks who are going to talk to us directly about the experiences that they've had at some of these organizations we've profiled. You can register for what's left of the series, and so I want to encourage you to do that. And then finally, there's an opportunity here at the conference board. You see the special code we promised you. For the Women's Leadership Conference. Beatrice will be there talking a little bit more about this report in particular. This is always one of our biggest and best leadership development programs, and it's just very exciting when you get that many people in the room who are all kind of pushing the flywheel to get some real change done. So with that, I'm going to thank you all for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure, Beatrice, to be with you today.
Great.
And after the webcast, if you'll hang around for just a couple minutes, tell us how fabulous we were or how we could be more fabulous. I read every one of those, and I'm very interested in your thoughts. So you have been a terrific, terrific group. I don't think I have ever in my life seen this many comments. I mean, we're having all these conversations. We didn't even need to be here. It's good. But thank you all for joining, and I look forward to the remaining webcasts, and let us know if we can be of service to you. Bye-bye now, and thank you.
Thank you.